We good? Everyone settled? Cell phones off?
Cell phones off.
We're speeding?
Sound speeds.
Carl, thank you so much for doing this.
I was a terrible, terrible student. It was doubtful that I was going to graduate from high school. And I spent most of my time at the pool hall. And my father could sense that I at least could write a little bit and pass essay exams, though nothing else. And he got me an interview for a job as a copy boy at the Washington Star, the town's afternoon paper. And I took one look at that newsroom and I said, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And this is what I want to do. And it took me about 4 more months. I was still growing, and it took me about 4 more months of knocking on the door there to get hired until I got a little taller. And I went to work in August of 1960. First, it was this commotion, the likes of which I had never seen, that it was purposeful chaos. And you could see the purpose of it when 5 times a day, and this first visit that I had, and I was being shown the newsroom by the guy who was interviewing me, and the paper had just come off the press, and it was warm, and it was on a dolly, and he handed me one with a red streak down the side, the final edition. And I had, as a kid, I had served, I had a paper route with the Washington Star. And here was the other end of it. And I had read newspapers since I was a little kid. And it was just, that was it. The Washington Star, it was a better newspaper than the Washington Post at the time. It also was an old-fashioned newspaper in terms that the Post wasn't, in terms of having great characters who had hung over from World War II, as well as some of the greatest reporters in the country. David Broder covered politics, Mary McGrory, I was her favorite copy boy, Haynes Johnson, great reporters. So what I got right away was they allowed copy boys to cover local civic meetings. And the local civic meetings turned out, if you went to cover the LeDroit Park Civic Association, you quickly discovered that was the Black Civic Association. And if you went to cover the LeDroit Park Citizens Association, that was the white one. And so right away, this is my 5 years at the Star bracket the Civil War by exactly 100 years. So race, the question of race and the legacy of the Civil War was very much a part of the news and everything we did. And I think that too figured in the way I looked at journalism and at reporting. Almost everything we were covering, unless it was watching a nun kick a football, for some kind of feature, a back-to-school feature. Race was an element, and it was compelling. But also, the Star was interesting because the way I got the job, my father had been the organizer for a left-wing government workers union that had been red-baited during the McCarthy era. And the reason that he had me go to the Washington Star and interview there was his contact there had covered a strike by his union with great fairness, whereas the Washington Post coverage by its government columnist had red-baited the union. And the Star had a sense of truth and accuracy and regard for real fact that the Post did not have at the time. That's when Bradley came. And when Bradley came to the Post, one of the first things that you could see, it was like a cleanup operation of this legacy of the Post, which had great things like Herb Block, great writers, great reporters, but the management of the paper, it skewed politically in a way that the beliefs of the publisher and the management bled into the reporting of the paper in a way that was noticeable. And at the Star, it was an article of faith that we didn't do that. Whereas, and we regarded the Post as infected and almost toxic with this politicized, even though it was politicized in a way that we probably all agreed with. So there came very early these great reporters who had a regard for getting to the Woodward and I both, I don't know if in your interview with Woodward, if you used this, but both he and I have used this expression, the best obtainable version of the truth. This notion of the best obtainable version of the truth, I don't know which one of us first said it, but it goes back to what I learned at the Star. And that was the difference between the two papers. And I think your question is what I got right away from these people when I was 16 years old, and these folks are, you know, the youngest of them were 22 and 23, and most of them were in their 40s. But this was a part of their being and their makeup, and I don't think I romanticize it. I did 5 years at the Star. They made me a reporter in the summers. I had dropped out of college, and they insisted that I finish college to stay a reporter, and there was no way I was going to finish college. So I left the Star, a failure, because they would not let me, you know, I did not want to stay a dictationist, which I was, and kind of a part-time reporter, half a reporter and half a dictationist. Didn't want to finish college, and I went to New Jersey, the assistant city editor of the Star, became the editor of a paper in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I went up there for a year with him, and I won a bunch of prizes, and got hired by the Post the next year in 1966. That was one of the reasons I wanted to go to the Post, because of what Ben was starting to do with the paper. You could see it, and again, the Star wasn't going to hire me even with whatever prizes I had won or whatever, because they wanted me to graduate from college. And when I got hired at the Post, I believe I was the only non-college graduate to have been hired there, certainly in the 1960s. First, it's important to understand that he wasn't totally in charge of the paper yet. He was struggling to get total control of it, especially from those who were responsible for this continuing slant or bleeding of particularly on local news. The news just wasn't straight enough in the Washington Post yet, and at the same time, it was becoming and had become a better paper than the Star. You got to look at all kinds of things, including the sclerotic management of the Star, the diminution of afternoon newspapers, and the Post had a bigger staff. But my first impression of the Post, and I don't know how much this had to do with Bradley, but it was like a goddamn insurance company. I couldn't believe it. Cohen knows this story. There was a moment, you know, I'd started as a copy boy, and I worked in a place where, I mean, it was a little bit like the front page, and you know, people hollering copy all the time, and copy boys running, me included, to grab a piece of copy, and there was a night during Watergate, and I think it was maybe during the Agnew story that you and I were doing together. And a guy named Jack Lemon, who I'd been with at the Star, was the news editor, is that right? And he hollered copy. And I jumped up instinctively I was the only person in the place that even recognized, I think, what that was. Nobody ever hollered copy in the Washington Post newsroom. There was a decorum to the place that was foreign to me. And the editor of the paper, a guy named Russ Wiggins, who had been a favorite, testified before the Un-American Committee, and then he wasn't our friend anymore. But his son was probably the person responsible more than anyone else for this bleeding into the news columns of opinion or point. And I think the Post might have been better than the Star in some ways. He hired Len, he hired, I don't know, 10, 15 of us. And we were kind of known, and I was the last of the pack maybe, as Isaac's boys. C. Bradley, I didn't meet him when I was hired. I was hired by Isaacs, and then I came in for a meeting with Ben Gilbert. But then it was clear with the famous look, the hair slicked back. I guess Ben must have been in his mid-40s in 1966, was this galvanizing figure whom you sensed, like anything I had seen at the Star, I was kind of be more different in many regards, and yet it was just extraordinary. I have to say, there was a glamour to Bradley. You knew partly from the tale of his life, but you also sensed it with this physicality and his hands-on way of running the newsroom, which was apparent already. Never forget that fear also enters into the picture, and I think it's true of particularly reporters in their 20s who have this huge regard for this towering figure. But I definitely think a healthy fear was part of it, and begin to socialize with, and much like Sid Epstein before, in that regard. Sid never had really anything to do outside the office with members of the staff. I don't think Ben had very much to do. There was an integration. I think that came with Watergate and after Watergate. Who he was, and it was a natural evolution for him, and particularly, I think, in the journalistic culture of the city and the country became greater, that forcefulness that came not just from intellect, but also from instinct, principle, physicality, theatricality. I think it all had this kind of perfect meld that was really unlike anything that I'd ever seen. And the principle part of it is really important. Simple fear is much too simple a concept for what he did. He loved news. He loved the news. But rooted in that was a regard for the truth that was absolutely extraordinary. And I don't know how naturally he came to that, given the history which he wrote about and talked about himself, with his closeness to the Kennedys, with the way Newsweek covered news, with his role in the Paris embassy as a spokesman. So I don't know the evolution, and I think his time at the Post from the first days that he got there, and maybe partly because of what I described about this bleeding that it was apparent, and some of this bleeding came from Phil Gramm. I don't think there's any question about that, and it came from the Meyer family as well. This remarkable family, but I don't think this was their strong suit. And it's funny when you think of Don Gramm. Don Gramm eventually went there in spades off to the other side. It's neither here nor there, but Don took non-advocacy to an extreme that I don't think Ben would have embraced. I think there was a different understanding of what kind of advocacy Ben came to stand for, because it was an advocacy, but it was a journalistic advocacy based on this idea of the best obtainable version of the truth. I mean, he was the perfect extension of that ethic and ethos and belief. I think too much of historical revisionism about Ben is based on a misassumption that in his relationship with the Kennedys, he knew of Jack Kennedy's affairs. I don't believe he did. He said he did not, including the affair with his sister-in-law, and I'm prepared to believe that, partly because at the Star at the time, we didn't know about it either, and we were doing all kinds of investigations of Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson at the paper at the time of the assassination of Kennedy. And certainly nobody at the Star, sure, we knew about Kennedy when he was single and ran around town with George Smathers, but I take Ben at his word. So that I think of all things, there has grown up a myth about Ben that goes maybe too far to the other side. But yes, he was close to the Kennedys, and it was impossible, even in 1966, to separate his glamour in some ways from Kennedy glamour. I think it was impossible. That came gradually. But there was still, he was wearing some clothes figuratively and literally from that experience. I also think that what he first saw at the Washington Post in this thing I'm describing about this bleeding of news and opinion, and I might be exaggerating it a little bit. You should talk to some other people about it. But I think he was mightily affected by it, and I think it probably led to some introspection, either conscious or unconscious. The other thing we haven't mentioned is Bradley had the best bullshit detector of anybody I've ever met, period. Whether it's personal, whether it had to do with the news, he got it. You know, every once in a while, Woodward and I would have a story, and we really knew we had it, and his bullshit detector was a little too sensitive, and we would fight him. But he had this sensitivity, both about people bullshitting him and repertorial information that was bullshit that he was damn near unerring about. And it also, it was like a mechanism in him. I mean, he'd go like this, you'd be talking to him, and you'd be 15 seconds into the conversation, come on, Bernstein, that's it. You know, and oh, fuck, you know, he's got me. In terms of Bradley, I felt maybe a sense of outsiderness, certainly, and the people that were hired in the Bradley era were almost all Ivy Leaguers. There are a few that were not, but by and large, they went to Ivy League schools. And some of that preceded Bradley, actually, at the Post, too. I got to think about my self-perception at the time in terms of one of the things about the Post newsroom that was different than the Star. The Star had a kind of camaraderie that transcended age, position. I mean, every Saturday night after the Sunday paper had been put to bed, 25, 30 of us would go to somebody's house, and we would stay there drinking and talking and having the time of our lives till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Nothing like that went on at the Washington Post. But what did go on among Isaac's boys and the younger reporters on the local staff at the Post was deep friendships developed. And among about 10 or 12 people, and my friends might have been 2 or 3 I was really closer with than the others, but nonetheless, there was a sense of this group of us that, and so in that sense, I did not feel apart. And whatever the Peck's bad boy reputation came from, probably was justified in the sense of a kind of erratic performance in some ways, which is that I kind of wanted to do what I wanted to do, and if I didn't think the assignment was something that I really wanted to do, I would try to get rid of that assignment, do it in as perfunctory a way, covering a meaningless court hearing, and then get back to the long feature I was working on that I really cared about it. So I kind of had my own agenda in a way that I did not at the Star, because by then I'd become known a little bit as a kind of writer, as a kind of stylist. There are certain things I was interested in covering, and I did not want to do as many of the duty coverage assignments with the kind of energy and time that others might have wanted. There also was a I'll say in my own defense here, there is a myth attached in some way, which is I had migraine headaches up until from the period of until I was 24, and I had them in the first years at the Post still. And one day when I covered the district building, as happened not infrequently, I had to lie down because I got a migraine. It was terrible. And the city editor came down, Isaacs came down there that day, and I was on the couch like this, And I think maybe you have to ask other people, but that incident, I think, became mythologized, perhaps. I'm probably the worst judge of my own reputation in terms of the reality of what was going on at the time. But I was Peck's bad boy. If I was good enough to have gotten the top assignments. Within a couple of years, I was covering the district building. I covered the courts, was doing investigative series. But in terms of an erratic aspect, absolutely. Erratic meaning I want to do what motivates me, and I didn't necessarily agree with the agenda of the duty coverage, and I'm sure that contributed to whatever view of me there was by the management. He liked holy shit stories. He liked, he liked attention. He had a great weakness journalistically, and that was that he later confessed to, and that was not understanding the power or the importance of the anti-war movement. And those of us who covered the anti-war movement both sensed it and resented it. It came to a head several times, probably with the great demonstration at the Pentagon that Norman Mailer wrote Armies of the Night about. And Bob Kaiser and myself, and there was a group of us, I'd say 6, 8 of us, that covered demonstrations together. The chief demonstration reporter, because the local side covered them, was a guy named Paul Valentine. And he would put together he would write the main story. There would be 6 of us listed at the bottom who had contributed to the story, but it often would carry Valentine's name. And those of us who covered these demonstrations understood both the dynamic, the texture, I think the effect in some ways of these demonstrations culturally, that Ben was really not blind to, but he didn't really get it. And so the March on the Pentagon, which turned violent and was the first of the really violent demonstrations, that Bob Kaiser and I were in the front, and we got pushed back by the bayonets of soldiers and marshals, and it really turned bloody, and we retreated into the Pentagon. And I guess it was I don't know if it was the press room, and we were like under tables, because people were rushing the building, and we were inside, and we were dictating back this scene that was unlike anything that we had observed. And Bradley thought we were exaggerating. I mean, it was apparent from the story what was used and what wasn't. And he thought we were somehow wearing it on our sleeves, or that we were exaggerating what was happening and the level of violence and the provocations, and particularly the behavior of the marshals. And the next day, Bradley saw it on television, and he said, "You guys were right." But then it and I can't remember the chronology of all this, but it sort of kept happening. And finally, and the other great demonstration that was so different than the others was the one where the Vietnam vets threw their medals over the wall, John Kerry leading them, actually. The first time I met or covered or saw John Kerry. And it was moving and beyond belief. And again, I think there was a sense Ben had that we were wearing this thing on our sleeves a little too much. But what really changed him was that Dick Harwood's wife, Bea, got involved in some of the demonstrations, as I recall. But those demonstrations, and finally, either it was the wives or a bunch of us that told Bradley and the managing editor, Eugene Patterson, that they ought to go down and look at these demonstrations and get a better handle on them. And they did. And I think they came back somewhat changed, but it took a long, long time. What Ben might have had more of a problem embracing, and this is all speculation, is the notion that really what was essentially a new left movement that was anathema to where he came from. It was not Washington-centric in the way that most political movements are or have been in our time, that really a lot of it came from elsewhere in the country. The radical elements of it particularly came from elsewhere in the country. Weatherman, SDS, those, and there was a violent element that would be very hard for anybody to embrace, that was fused in some way with the mainstream movement, that you couldn't totally separate everything. And I think that was repellent to Bradley and his experience. There were plenty of older people who were involved in this movement, and it became a mainstream movement. That's the importance. He didn't get that it became a mainstream movement that was changing the culture of the country, as well as the politics of the country. I think he was slow to recognize that. I mean, I don't know what Ben thought or wrote later or talked about in terms of that demonstration of the Vietnam vets, because I'm trying to remember, because I remember coming back I remember this gray wall, and I remember these guys throwing these medals up there, and I remember those of us covering it breaking down. And I wonder how Ben internalized that. I have no idea. Ben had a notion of citizenship that and conduct that perhaps was not consistent with his rather isolated view from inside the newsroom of what was going on in the streets. I mean, I think he was isolated until people in his family and others started saying, hey, we're going out there in the streets. What's so strange about that episode is that he once told me, I can't remember if it was after Watergate and we had become close or if it was earlier, about covering that demonstration. And I said, Bradley, I was in the pool. And the reason was that my parents were left-wing activists, and most of their activities were about desegregating the public accommodations of the District of Columbia, including the restaurants, and which downtown were segregated by local law, and the swimming pools, which were run by the D.C. Recreation Department. And so we had these wade-ins, we called them, where white and black kids, especially in Anacostia, where we would go on, a black kid and a white kid, as I remember it, we would hold hands and we would go into the pool, and then they closed the pools down. They drained the pools. In fact, when I was a kid in Washington, you couldn't go swimming in the summers because either they drained the pools because they didn't want black kids to swim with white kids, or there was polio. So you couldn't swim in the summers. Ben Gilbert, who would have been the city editor then, actually, he would have been the city editor. He became a city editor during the war, I think. Gilbert must have been Bradley's boss, actually. The way the Washington Post saw itself, on great moral questions, and it wasn't, the Post point of view wasn't wrong, and the Post had these incredible, great editorials. Whereas the Star, you know, we used to say at the Star, you know, we'd look at our own editorial page and we'd go, you know, because we used to call it the View with Alarm page. I mean, we view with alarm. That was about as strong as anything got in terms of the Star really having a kind of advocacy for the kind of, in desegregation matters, the kind of really active advocacy that should have been on the editorial page. But in the case of the Post, it flipped over into the news in a way again, that was unnecessary. You know, if you could cover these demonstrations, you could cover these events without abrogating journalistic principle simply by, it's one of the reasons that the reporting from the South in the civil rights movement was so powerful, is that the great reporters, you know, sitting at the Times, people at the Washington Post, Haynes Johnson at the Washington Star, others, that the reporting was so great and so powerful was because it was descriptive, but it was not advocacy in the sense that an editorial would have been. And there was too much in the Washington Post, as I was saying earlier, that was a kind of, and particularly if you'd grown up at the Washington Star, you just looked at it and you were taken aback. And I think maybe Ben was, I keep coming back to that. I think he was, that was partly his mission, was to get the Post past that. New England, Massachusetts, war, women, a kind of swaggering glamour that both had, intellect and advantage from class, money. That would be the list off the top of my head. And fun. Fun would be a real part of it. Kind of joy about doing vocationally what you loved. I went to almost all of Kennedy's press conferences when I was a copy boy and a dictationist. And one of the things I could see about Bradley and about Kennedy was the joy of the experience. When you watched Kennedy at the State Department auditorium in those press conferences, and the use of words and the fun he was having and tweaking the press a little bit, you could see the same when you watch Bradley on the floor. And you also got a sense of both these guys liked being on a big stage. They enjoyed it. And they were thespians as well as naturals. One thing Sid Epstein said to me once, I was surprised. He sent me up to the National Press Club to pick up some picture up there or something. And he said, "Kid, don't ever join that thing." He said, "I'm not a member. Take it from me. Don't ever." You know, it was about don't get too close. And Bradley also, as I recall, had not joined the National Press Club. And that there was this idea, don't get too close. And again, I think Bradley came to realize he had been too close. it also was pretty easy, temperamentally, intellectually, for him not to be too close to the Lyndon Johnson people. If you look at the dynamic and who they were and who he was and what had happened and all the rest, I think that circumstance also made it easier in the Johnson years, which is what we're talking about here. But the closeness, there was an elite of, the gridiron crowd of senior national reporters in the town, and maybe a dozen of them were, if you include figures like Joe Alsop, and who were columnists, or 15 of them who kind of were insiders in a way that that was obvious and unjournalistic. I don't know that I ever regarded Ben quite that way, because he had never come to my attention when he was the bureau chief, for instance, at Newsweek. When he came to my attention is when, after Phil Gramm died and Catherine chose him, and I could see what he was doing. When Ben was at Newsweek, am I right in thinking that Time was so much bigger and more important? Let me go there. I mean, in the world that I knew as a teenaged apprentice in the newspaper business, learning that Time magazine was the big deal. Newsweek was not. Newsweek became big after Bradley had left. That it was not in the same league of importance in the pecking order of national journalism. The pecking order of national journalism, as I saw it as a kid growing up at the Star, was the New York Times, the Washington Star, the Washington Post, yes, with an asterisk, the Chicago Tribune. Every morning when I was a copy boy, we would get the bundles of papers and we would dole them out. And it was pretty obvious what counted in journalism. And Newsweek was not at the top of that list in a way that the Times, the Post, the Star, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times were. I think in the telling of the Bradley narrative, the popular narrative, some of that may have been forgotten. That the Newsweek, and being a bureau chief of Newsweek, it might have had a kind of cachet in official Washington, but it was not a player on the scale of the daily newspapers or even close to Time magazine. So I think there's a famous quote from Bradley when I'd give my left one. Is that right? Well, he sure would. Because Newsweek was, I wouldn't call it an also-ran, but Bradley was the figure there. Newsweek was not the Holy Grail by any means. He transcended that bureau. You can make too much of a reporter not going to lunch or dinner with the people he's covering. Yeah, you can get too close But I would highly recommend sometimes going to lunch or dinner with the people you're covering, and getting to know them. My experience as a reporter has always been to let the person you're dealing with tell you his or her story. And to do that requires an established intimacy, actually, not necessarily great distance. And the intimacy comes from respecting that person telling you his or her story. When you see it's an obvious lie, then say, my understanding is X, Y, and Z, and you're not telling me the truth here. But give that person a chance to tell that story, because you'll learn more by letting that happen than running in and firing off a bunch of hostile questions. Other reporters do it different. But that's always been my approach. And so I think that the notion of instinctive, immediate adversarial opposition to the person you're covering. Look, Woodward and I did not have sources in Watergate among Democrats who knew anything. The people we talked to and established a kind of, you see it in the movie of All the President's Men, a kind of intimacy even with those sources. Came from respecting them. They worked for Nixon. Some of them remained very devoted to his politics. They might have been horrified by what they eventually came to see. But back to that best obtainable version of the truth notion. That's what you're trying to get from people. So I'm not sure that that I subscribe to. I think that the Ben Bradlee tale of closeness may have been, I don't know enough, may have been exaggerated. Whatever the case, he got a lot of very good stories. And so did he miss the biggest story of all, which were Kennedy's secrets? And I also don't think he got all these stories just from Jack Kennedy, incidentally. Did he miss the biggest story of all, which were Jack Kennedy's secrets, because he was close? I don't know. It's a really great question. And what were the secrets? Obviously, the women were the secrets, were part of the secrets, and his physical health were the other part of it. And then comes the question of was Kennedy waiting in his presidency for re-election to do the things that he should have done or wanted to do in a first term, and that was also part of the story. And you'd have to go back and look at Bradlee's coverage to see whether it reflected any of that doubt. I think you know when you don't do the story and you know the story is there. And I think with both Bob and myself in Watergate and in the years since, we've each wrestled with those questions at various times. And there's something in your gut that you just know, I need to go with this story, or I got to talk to my colleagues about it and see what they say. I can't just hold on to this myself. It's tricky. It's very, very tricky. One of the things, and it's part of Bradlee's greatness, is back to this question of what is news and going with it. he made a lot of courageous decisions about what is news. Maybe some of that, I keep suggesting, goes back to have looking at some of his earlier decisions and doing a gut check. I don't know. The fact that I didn't know when we had a team of 5 people at the Washington Star at the time of the assassination looking at all kinds of stuff going on involving women because of Bobby Baker, because of Lyndon Johnson, because of what was going on in Smathers, who had been involved with Kennedy and women early on. I got to tell you, and I knew a lot of what this team was doing. Jack Kennedy and women, no suggestion of it in the White House. And look at Clinton, who had this reputation, deservedly so, beyond womanizing. I mean, a compulsive disorder, which perhaps Kennedy also had. And listen to what Hillary Clinton was saying, that she thought that him being locked up in the White House, a golden cage, would make it impossible. When you think about it, it's pretty extraordinary what was going on at the White House, and I don't know who knew about it. Bradley, with this incredible sense of the possibilities of this newspaper in perhaps ways that the Grahams and the Myers had never really envisioned in journalistic terms, of breaking out of a certain journalistic mold, and kind of journalistic mold that other papers, other great papers, were still inhibited by. And I'm thinking now of the style section, for instance. I mean, that particular piece of genius goes to Bradley every bit as much as Watergate or the Pentagon Papers do. I mean, the decision to go ahead on the Pentagon Papers is a kind of no-brainer if you're an editor. I think Bradley had a sense, an editor's sense of a modern newspaper that no editor of his time had, with the possible exception of the people at the Herald Tribune in New York before Bradley. That there, too, magazine journalism had come to define a newspaper and create a non-traditional newspaper and expanded the boundaries of daily journalism. And so the invention of the style section was a huge contribution to expanding the notion of what a daily newspaper could be. And that came from Bradley, not from the Grahams or the Myers. Pentagon Papers was a no-brainer for an editor. You go with the story. Watergate required incredible decision-making on all kinds of levels, including how do we edit this story, how much can we say, how do we respond to the pressures we're under, and that required great collaboration between Ben and Catherine, an unusual kind of collaboration between editor and publisher, I think. But their relationship, I think you need to go to their respective their respective autobiographies and memoirs. That Catherine had a very girlish side. I got to see it when I was married to Nora, and we would see Catherine socially. And Catherine would talk about her days at the San Francisco Chronicle and being a young female reporter there. And it was like a whole other person, the side of which you did not get when you were at that mansion on R Street, and around four tables were the likes of Henry Kissinger and Joe Alsop and this one and that one. This was something else. And this girlish side of Catherine, which I don't think too many people got a chance to see, was really fabulous. And I think Bradley picked up on that. I think that they both were able to exhibit part of their youthful side in what they brought professionally and what they brought intellectually to their respective positions. And somehow there was some frisson there, not sexual, male, female, yes, but great admiration for the persona and experience, life experience of the other. And I think that Ben's recognition of what Catherine had been through with Phil Gramm was profound, and he probably got as good or better look at her transition into being a publisher and a world figure, because she was a publisher and publisher of this particular newspaper. And the Pentagon Papers is the crucible in terms of that experience between them. There are perhaps heroics in putting out an APB of how do we get hold of these papers, but any editor would have given his left one, to use a Bradleyism, to get hold of the papers and follow the New York Times once that injunction was in place, et cetera, et cetera. That's an easy decision from the point of view of an editor. In terms of the pressure that the publisher was under, it was enormous, absolutely enormous, and particularly because the Times had already taken the big risk. Now this was about solidarity. It was about principle. The Post was never going to get credit for breaking the story the way the Times had, but it was defining. It was defining for her as a publisher, and it was defining for the Post as a kind of news organization that was committed to a set of principles that met the test of the day. This was a new test. This was not about tradition necessarily. This was a new place of the rubber hitting the road, and it was a declaration that the Post was going to, next cliche, put the pedal to the metal, whatever, and go forward here and get out, quickly as they could. And once that decision was made, and she wrestled with it, I have no idea except what I've read I never discussed the Pentagon Papers really with Catherine, and I think what she wrote about it is pretty good. Bradley is a pretty convincing guy, and there's also an upside to this, to be cynical. And the upside is you do the right thing and you come out on the winning side of this thing, and you have established something for what you believe in and the future foundation of this newspaper as a pillar of certain values in the country and the business. And I cannot imagine that Ben would not have made some sort of presentation that included those points. And I think that that sensibility and the understanding of risk, and at the same time, I know Ben Bradley could not have walked down the street and lifted his head high knowing he had those papers and his newspaper wouldn't publish them. And I know there is no way that he would not have conveyed that to Katharine Graham. And does she write it quite that way in her memoir? No. But I'll betcha that somehow he conveyed that for him to walk down the street, and you too, Katharine, somehow that was, I can't believe that wasn't conveyed, knowing both of them. I was the one of two chief Virginia correspondents for the Post, meaning that I traveled around the state. I covered the legislature. I lived in Richmond, the capital, during the legislative session. It was a wonderful, wonderful job. And that day, the Saturday morning, I had come into the paper because I was writing a profile of a great progressive politician, Lieutenant Governor Henry Howell of Virginia, who was running for governor. And I was probably a little late with handing it in, which is why I was there on a Saturday morning. And there was this commotion over on the city desk. And I went over to see what it was. And it was about this story that 5 guys had been arrested at the Watergate, wearing rubber gloves and business suits. And I said to myself, Jesus, this looks like a much better story to me for right now than Henry Howell. Henry Howell can wait. So I went into Harry Rosenfeld, the city editor, and said, Harry, I'd like to, how about I make some calls on this? And I was kind of known as somebody who could get information on the phones pretty good. And he sort of shrugged his acceptance. I think in the movie of All the President's Men, he might say something about where's the other story. I don't remember that happening. I think he just sort of said, go ahead. So I started, and I heard that Woodward was down at the courthouse for the arraignment of these guys, and then I started making calls based on their identifications down to Florida, where several of them lived. And I also called the Watergate and talked to some people there in the hotel, and started to come up with some information. And then the next day, Woodward and I were told to come in to the office and continue work on the story. What you see in the movie of All the President's Men and it comes from the book about the way Woodward and I looked at each other and viewed each other at the time is accurate. He hadn't been at the Post very long. There was a view of him that I shared in the newsroom that he was a kind of brown noser who And there also was a kind of split in the newsroom at the time among those who were really active in the newspaper guild, of which I was one, and those who weren't. And I think Woodward was distinctly in the latter category, and all of us worked. You know, if you're going to do something in this business, you got to work 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And we all did that. Any of us who wanted to get ahead knew you did this. But you also put in for some overtime. I don't think Woodward put in for the overtime. And we wouldn't put in for 8 hours overtime a day. But we still had a sense of the management and us. I think that was part of the coloration. But also that Woodward hadn't been there very long, that he was treated favorably in a way that the rest of the troops were not. We would sometimes go to lunch in the park in McPherson Square, a bunch of us, and we would sit and eat our lunch together outside. And I remember in a previous week or two, a bunch of us talking about Woodward, and with a kind of, you know, what's this all about? That this guy is, he's writing about these rat droppings in restaurants and things, but they're, you know, they're not those great stories anyhow, and they're on the front page, and just a sense that. And he sure as hell wasn't out there in the park with us having lunch. So I think there was a kind of, he had established himself very early as different from the rest. And that included people like Downey, Hoagland, you know, were considered great reporters. But there was something different in the way he conducted himself that we didn't know about or something, and something different in the way he certainly was viewed by the city editor or by Harry Rosenfeld, and maybe by Bradley. I don't know if there was a sense of that or not, but that something was conveyed that was different. And it was not, whatever the difference was, it was not widely considered admirable. And that's not about the dynamic between the two of us. That is the, what do you think the word? That's the predetermined assumption that I and some others made, and Woodward had made the assumption about me that is written in All the President's Men, and he wrote that particular paragraph about long hair and maybe kind of a hippie and countercultural, etc. It turned out very quickly, really quick, that the predetermined caricature that each of us had of the other was woefully inadequate. And so very quickly, the dynamic between us developed of using our respective strengths, complementary skills, but very often surprisingly reversing roles from the predetermined, accepted, cartoonish notion of either of us. We would flip it. I'm supposed to be the really terrific writer. Well, Woodward would come up with a phrase that I couldn't have invented. He's supposed to be the guy that gets up at 5 in the morning and goes knocking on the door. Well, I got up at 4 one morning and waited for somebody to come outside the house. So there's this constant reversal of roles. And the movie does it fairly brilliantly, actually, more perhaps than the book expresses it. And I think that has a lot to do with why things worked. But very quickly, we developed enormous respect for the abilities of the other, as well as very quickly a sense, because we didn't understand the management of the paper. They were way above our pay grade. We understood a little bit about Harry Rosenfeld and the level of the city editor and Barry Sussman, who made enormous contributions to our work. Bradley, certainly early on, the functioning, even him and Simons early on, that was above our pay grade. And in fact, what Woodward and I shared early on was a view that we were coming up with this information and we had to be sure that we could get it into the paper and in a fashion make a presentation to the editors even before we wrote the story that would get into the paper what we wanted and thought the story was. And sometimes we got sat on a little bit, and so we would become a little more determined to, and sometimes we use a good cop, bad cop routine. I was not usually the good cop. And then, again, as recounted in the book, you begin to see the interaction of us at the level not just of Rosenfeld, but of Simons and Bradley in a way that was very different than it had happened with local reporters before on a running story. There are two things to remember. You have to look at a chronology of the stories to see what's happening. In the first days of the story, certainly my belief was that this was not necessarily about the Nixon White House, but that it might well go to the CIA. And I think I wrote a memo, or I said that. And then, and here's where the movie is absolutely fabulous in terms of showing the larger picture of how reporters work, and you really see it visually, knocking on the doors, and everything takes place at night, and the role of the editors and of the larger institution. But in terms of the progression of the story and our reaction to it, the book is invaluable on this. I'm just saying this to you to take a look at, because one, it's much more incremental and gradual than the movie conveys. And in those first days, a few crucial things happened that are not, I believe, in the movie. One is there was a conventional, they called it a third-rate burglary, and there was, I think, an almost conventional belief that perhaps why would they do this? Why would the Nixon White House and these smart folks over there, why would they have anything to do with this kind of thing? And I went to David Broder, who was the political reporter. I'd been at the Star with him, and I said, David, is there somebody, I don't know anything about the Nixon White House, is there somebody you know who I can call that would have some idea of how this might relate? Because I can't imagine it. And so he gave me the name of a guy named Odie Fish. And the name's not in All the President's Men. And he was a national committeeman for the Republican Party from Wisconsin, as I believe. And I called this guy, and he said, I was just talking to Bob Dole about this. And I said, this must have been one of those 10-cent generals at the White House. And I went, whoa, what is that about? And then I had the name of somebody who I knew had been, and maybe Odie Fish gave me the name, I can't remember, who had been associated with Nixon and during the sweepstakes was among those thought to be Deep Throat perhaps, but who was an invaluable source throughout, partly because of his great understanding of the White House and the people there. And I got him on the phone, and he too said something akin to that. So that gave us a sense that it was not impossible that somehow, not at the level of the President of the United States, but at the level of the 10-cent general, and we had some ideas who the 10-cent generals might be as we learn more about the White House structure. But that, and Deep Throat, the role that Deep Throat later plays also goes in that direction. You know, the movie overdoes the role of Deep Throat in the sense of it gives the idea that somehow we were the beneficiaries of these leaks or whatever, that was the basis of our coverage. The movie doesn't really do it, but the mythology that follows from it, when in fact mostly what Deep Throat did was confirm information that we had obtained elsewhere, and which was invaluable, but invaluable also the same way as those two people this is what they did, this is who they are. And so very quickly, and again, one of the great things about the way Bradley handled this, and Rosenfeld, and Simons, and Sussman, was allowing a kind of, we didn't know where the story was going to go. Again, maybe it would go to a 10-cent general. We didn't know. And what was this break-in about in the first place? What were they looking for? Who knew? But there is an incrementalism to the coverage of the story all through what we were doing. I'm not sure if you would have that incrementalism today at most news institutions. I don't know. In the sense that if you're dealing with a big investigative kind of thing, you got to wait till you get the whole thing and put it all together. That's not what happened. We didn't know what one story meant in relation to the other necessarily. We were just, here's this GAO report. It's got these people, and we know there's a check. This is about money. Let's go with the story of this GAO report. Maybe it's relevant. Maybe it'll lead somewhere, maybe it won't. So what's bubbling is very early, the White House begins to make the conduct of the Washington Post and Woodward and me and Bradley and eventually Catherine, but really these two reporters, what do they know? They're local reporters. Most of our colleagues in the Washington Press Corps were skeptical or didn't believe what we were writing, including a good number of them in the newsroom, including especially Dick Harwood, whom I revered. And so what you talk about, the bubbling up, the denials told us more in some regards than some of the information we were getting, as did the secrecy. When we got hold of that list of employees of the Committee for the Re-Election of the President, getting that document was like getting a classified thing out of the Pentagon. I mean, it was held in that kind of awe and secrecy and difficulty to get. We got it. Then we found out about the secret fund. And that started to make some sense about something, that there, and that there were projects, whatever these projects were, and that Gordon Liddy had. And we found out that Mitchell was among those, John N. Mitchell, the Attorney General of the former Attorney General of the United States, and Nixon's former law partner and manager of his campaign, that he was among those who controlled that fund. And that's about 8 weeks in. You'll have to double check the date. And Bradley said to us before we did that story, you know, there's never been a story like this. You're about to say the Attorney General of the United States is a crook or something like that. Each morning, Woodward and I would meet. By this time, we would go to the vending machine room, we had a coffee machine, and sit down and try to see where we were and what we were going to present to the editors that day. And we'd get in before they got there, and I think it was about 8:30 in the morning usually. And sometimes we would have talked the previous night, or we'd gone out together the previous night to knock on doors or whatever. So on this occasion, the day of the Mitchell story, and Bradley had already said there's never been a story like this, blah, 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 I put a dime in the coffee machine, which is what it cost for a cup of coffee then. And I literally felt a chill, literally, like you hear about, go down the back of my neck. And I turned to Woodward and I said, oh my God, this president is going to be impeached. And Woodward looked at me and said, oh my God, you're right. And we can never use that word impeach or impeachment around this newsroom because somebody might believe we have an agenda and we don't. I don't know, and this was like months and months before anybody thought of the idea. But the fact of what we, back to the 10-cent generals becoming Mitchell, and we thought by then that Haldeman controlled it, that whatever this was, something, produced that reaction. And we left it out of All the President's Men, rightly or wrongly. It's the one thing we did, maybe a little questionable. We left it out because we knew that All the President's Men was going to be published while Nixon was still in office. And even then, we didn't want to give, and the last lines of the book are something about Nixon had vowed to stay in office, and the last lines quote Nixon about vowing to stay in office, and he said this to the members of the Congress, blah, blah, blah. But even then, we kept that out of the book. I don't know where that story goes, but it fits with your question about bubbling. What we then, even though we had that instinctive moment, then we ceased to believe it was likely because it looked like the cover-up was working until the tapes were revealed. It really looked, even up until the Ervin Committee, the White House horrors, up until then, it really looked like the cover-up was working. And I don't think either Woodward or I thought this was going to result in impeachment then. And in fact, we had contracted for a book. And what the book was going to be was to try and unravel this cover-up that was persisting. And that was our idea of a book, so that whatever the truth of all this was, maybe we could do some things in a book that we couldn't do in a newspaper, as well as we didn't know where the story was going to go. But writing All the President's Men about ourselves resulted from not having anything substantive to write about the story, because all the facts had come out during the Watergate hearings. Very early, the pattern was established that the White House was making the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate rather than the conduct of the president and his men. And the conduct of the press was also a shorthand for me, Woodward, often what do these young guys who are local police reporters know? And in the case of Bradley, a friend of Kennedy's, and et cetera. And that was the mantra. But when we did the Mitchell story, the response was, we always tried to get a response from the White House. So I called the White House on that Mitchell story that night, and I called the committee for re-elect, I guess. I got hold of a guy named Van Shumway, who was a communications director. And I read him the story about Mitchell controlling the fund. And said, what's your response? He said, let me get back to you with that. And he called back a few minutes later, and he said, the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. So I typed that out, and I said, yes, go ahead. And he said, that's it. That's our response. I said, well, aside from this geyser going off in our backyard here, this fountain of misinformation, is the story true? Did Mr. Mitchell control those funds, or did such funds exist? The sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. By then, we were really frustrated by it because it was working. And indeed, our conduct was every bit as up for grabs as anybody in the White House. So I had a phone number for Mitchell, who was living at the Essex House in New York, and I called him, and he answered the phone, and I told him why I was calling. There was a story in the next day's paper, and I started to read it to him, and I got as far as John N. Mitchell, while Attorney General of the United States, controlled a secret fund. And Mitchell said, Jesus, just like that. And read a few more words, and Mitchell said, Jesus, like that. And then I got to the end of the first paragraph. It's the only thing in All the President's Men is this scene that is not as it happened, because it doesn't convey what Mitchell was conveying. And that's when the attacks on the Post and the TV licenses and all the rest began. And it was in, and again, 8, 9 weeks, you'll have to look it up. But from there on in, the level and intensity was what correctly has become the narrative. It was one of the few times I got really scared a little bit. And both Woodward and I lived alone. And I decided I didn't want to, and we knew that Liddy, by this time somehow I knew that Liddy had threatened to kill Jack Anderson. And I didn't want to stay at home, so I called this girl in my neighborhood I seen occasionally, and said, can I come over for the night? And she said, okay. And I came over, and she said, but I have to leave really early in the morning. And I said, it's okay. I walked up the street to where she lived. And I said, where are you going in the morning? And she said, I'm going to Cuba to cut cane with the Venceremos Brigade. I said, Jesus Christ, that's going to do me a lot of good. The real thing that Bradley is doing at this point is saying, get some more stories. And that's really what he's saying. And then you get to the October 10th story that finally makes sense out of the Watergate break-in, that it was just part of a vast campaign of political espionage and sabotage directed from the White House and the people under the President of the United States to actually determine who the nominee of the Democratic Party for president would be is the tail end of what really that is about. The great thing about it is that we were really shaky, and he, I am sure, sensed it, because the day, first of all, it was raining like crazy, and we had had a meeting that morning with Dick Snyder, the head of Simon & Schuster, to sign, I think, to sign the agreement for the book. We did not tell Bradley that part of it, but that's where we were part of the morning. And then we didn't know we knew we had made a mistake, but we couldn't figure out what it was, because they would never have reacted the way they did and denied it, and not a non-denial denial, but a real vociferous, absolutely never before the grand jury. And it took us a couple days to actually figure out what the mistake was. And we really thought we might well have to resign from the paper. I mean, we talked about it, if this thing goes south any farther, and, we might have to quit, not to speak of what this means to the paper. But at the same time, it didn't make sense because of what Hugh Sloan had told us. So Bradley's instinct was brilliant, which was stand by the story. And when you think about it, it was more than bravado, because the story was right, that we had fucked up. We had made an error in the story, but the substance of the story was right. And what I think Bradley understood was something in here is wrong, but all this stuff is right. And you guys better figure out what the hell it is that's wrong, and let's figure this out. His instinct was so brilliant, and to very quickly say the Washington Post stands by the story, it gave us time to figure out what had happened. It was brilliant. And I can't remember what's in Catherine's autobiography about what the two of them were saying to each other at that moment. But we had no appreciation. Even when we wrote All the President's Men, Woodward and I had almost no real appreciation for what Bradley and Catherine had to go through. We really didn't. It was only later that we began to get a sense of the enormity of. We were fairly egocentric, as well as perhaps myopic. We think he's the editor. He knows he's got to go with a story. He's going to, he protect us because we're right. But there was an incredible and fabulous moment that did convey to us, and that was when the subpoena server came to the Washington Post, and I got a call from the guard at the desk saying he had a subpoena for our notes. And I said, just keep him down there. Don't let him upstairs. I called Bradley. Bradley said, hold on a minute. Just let me get back to you. And he called Catherine, and he called me back. And he said, okay, the first thing is get out of the office. Get the hell out. And I actually went to see the movie Deep Throat that afternoon. And when I got out of the office, and he said, they're not your notes. Catherine says they're her notes. And if anybody is going to go to jail for withholding, their notes and not turning them over, it's going to be her. That's amazing. I mean, even today, that's an amazing moment. That's the time, I guess, we most got the sense of how they were really, we had, they really protected us. But I don't think we appreciated it enough. At the time, and Bob probably told you about that meeting he had with Catherine where she says, don't tell me never, which is the other. And that was on October 10th. That was the day of that story, I think, because I was up at a funeral somewhere. But Bradley, look, let's not pretend that reporters don't love great stories. So to think that this was some kind of hardship duty that Woodward and I were on is wrong. We were energized and 2 years without a day off or a couple days off, and working 18-hour days or whatever it is. But that was no hardship, let me tell you. And I think Bradley understood that. I mean, you know, both he and Simons had this sense of energy that we had, and they got it. And I suspect that I'm extrapolating that Bradley saw something of himself on a great story here. And then he did what he was so great at, which was to motivate, protect, deal with the publisher and the editors in the place, the internal dynamic of the newsroom, which went from what are these guys doing over here to by the end of it, we got movie stars running around the newsroom, Redford and all that. It's a long progression over several years that he presided over this thing. And really, that's what he did. By the time of the Watergate hearings, he was presiding and not micromanaging. The micromanaging came from, on the story, came from Sussman, Rosenfeld some, and managing us more directly. But Bradley then became the director of all of these elements, including, remember, by the time of the Watergate hearings, you then have it's not just the investigative, quote, story that Woodward and I are doing to try and advance what's going on, and you're going to talk to John Dean today, because at that point, a lot of it is me talking to Dean's lawyers, but it's also got 15 reporters in the newsroom covering the breaking story. There was no breaking story to cover at the beginning. It was just what Woodward and I were writing. Now the dynamic of the story itself, the White House, its response, the Irvin hearings, you literally have 15 reporters on it. You got the national editor involved deeply. So Bradley is doing all of this at once. So, and is it in All the President's Men? No. But is it happening? Yes. And are we aware of it at that point? Very much so. Howard is not treated well enough in the movie, and Sussman, we were altogether wrong not to insist that Sussman's role be in there. And at the same time, Bradley's Bradley, and he's not just the beneficiary of Jason Robards. It's the fact that Robards got him. When Robards got the script, he said, I can't play Bradley. He doesn't do anything. And somebody, Pecouler, says, what do you mean? And Robards says, all he does is go around and says, where's the fucking story? And of course, that's what Bradley did. And he had 50 ways of saying, where's the fucking story? And 50 ways of beating you over the head and saying, where's the fucking story? And that is the essence of what Robards got. The first great moment of corroboration is Sirica in his courtroom getting the burglars to say they're being paid for their silence. That's the first great moment, again, because that is the cover-up to the White House. Yes, they're covering up. They're being paid to keep their mouths shut, as we have implied, said, reported, and Cy Hirsch also, et cetera. So that's the first of those moments. One of the things to keep in mind about Watergate, I don't know how it figures in this, and I don't know what Ben has said about it, but Watergate is really about the system working. And I think Ben, and you go back to Ben as a patriot or whatever, I think we all became patriots because of this experience of seeing the American system work. And I think Bradley sensed this, that here was the press doing what it was supposed to do. Here's this Republican-appointed judge by Eisenhower reading our stories, using the courtroom to extract this information. Here is the Senate of the United States, 77-0, voting to create an investigation of the campaign activities of the President of the United States. Well, you can imagine what would happen today. You could never get a 77 vote to the Senate for anything, much less to investigate the campaign activities of the President of the United States. Then you get Ervin, a Democrat constitutionalist, and a Republican vice chairman saying, what did the president know and when did he know it? The tapes, the firing of the special prosecutor, and the response once again of the system. Nixon won't give up the tapes. He thinks that the Chief Justice of the United States that he's appointed, Warren Burger, an undistinguished judge on a court of appeals, is going to save his ass and tell him he doesn't ever have to give up those tapes. And what happens? The Supreme Court decides it has to have a unanimous decision, so there can be absolutely no mistaking that no one in this country is above the law, including the President of the United States. And Nixon is ordered to give up his tapes. And then you have, that leads, what's on the tapes leads to the impeachment investigation, in which the key votes are cast for impeachment, articles of impeachment, by Republicans. Really courageous votes by Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee. So it's the whole system coming together, and then Nixon won't resign, and what happens? Barry Goldwater, the great conservative, nominee of his party to be president in 1964, leads a delegation of Republicans to the White House to talk to Nixon, and Nixon says, thinking that he's going to be able to prevail with more than a third of the Senate to acquit, which you need 2/3 vote of the Senate to be convicted of high crimes and misdemeanors. And Nixon says to Goldwater, Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate? Expecting that Goldwater is going to bail him out. Goldwater says, maybe 4, Mr. President, at this point, and you don't have mine. And that's when Nixon decided to resign, and he was out 48 hours later. So you were asking about the finality. It wasn't so sure there was going to be a finality, is my point, until Barry Goldwater went down there. It looked like this thing really might get played out in a Senate vote. And then when we did the final days, and even that week, we knew some stuff that was going on in the White House about Nixon's instability at the time. Not that it's perfectly reasonable to think that his own personal tragedy would be somewhat unstable in that kind of moment. But no, the finality actually came suddenly after Goldwater. You would have thought he would resign, but he wasn't going to. And we knew he was resisting. We knew that by this point that maybe Haig was trying to convince him to resign, but it was no sure thing. And then boom. So that's when the finality came. But no, it was not. It was sudden. I think it changed all of us, and we all handled it differently. Me probably the worst for a while there. And at the same time, there was, I think, we had an understanding, particularly the three of us, of why this thing had worked. I really believe that. And then by then, Bob and I started more and more to appreciate the role of Bradley and what had happened. And Catherine. There had never been anything in journalism like this. And in fact, the movie has a lot to do with it, even though All the President's Men came out, was a huge, #1 bestseller, and told this tale that we weren't even sure it was a tale. I mean, believe it or not. I mean, I don't say that to be sounding humble or something. We didn't know that this tale was going to capture the imagination the way it did. We really didn't. I guess by the time the book came out, we had a sense of it because of the serialization and you know, a lot of attention. You know, one of the things about Watergate is, I said earlier that everything was incremental in the story. Happily, pretty much everything was incremental institutionally, and I think with the three of us and our colleagues, you got used to it a little bit like getting in a warm bath. You know, get into scalding water, and it was tepid when we got in, and it got hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And the same happened with the fame stuff, or whatever you want to call it, and you're able to, at some point, and with some of us more difficulty than the others, but you're able to absorb it. It becomes part of your familiar environment. It's part of who you are. The good parts of it, the bad parts of it, the excessive parts of it, and the other thing is the Washington Post. That Bob and I felt very strongly that the Washington Post ought to become a national newspaper to compete with the Times on a national basis. And we went to Bradley, and meaning circulation, everything. And maybe we were, and this is probably the first time we really were bigger than our britches or whatever, but that we had done anything like this. And we went to bed and thought this really was, now you'd had the Pentagon Papers, you'd had this, we'd beat the Times, you'd had this amazing thing happen, and there are movies and all that. Let's be a national newspaper, and Ben wanted to do it. Catherine, and I don't know who else finally said no. And I think we thought that was a regrettable decision, and I think Ben, am I right? That Ben thought it was a regrettable decision. I think Ben regretted that decision, and Bob and I regretted that decision in a major way. I left January 1st, 1977, and Ben was really unhappy about that, angered by it. Those are other tales that don't have too much to do with Ben, I don't think, but it also the dynamic between Bob and myself at the time, between Nora, Bob, myself, et cetera, et cetera. But Bradley wanted me to write a local column, and I didn't want to do that. Nixon, first of all, what we were able to establish and what the Watergate hearings and the White House horrors, John Mitchell's term, showed was an abuse of power on a scale that had never occurred in our history and hopefully never will again, though the portents are certainly there now. And there's one thing I didn't say in terms of Bradley, and that is my own background. Coming from a left-wing family, parents before the Un-American Committee took the Fifth Amendment. There's a record of that. Early on, I went to Bradley and said, look, you got to understand that my parents have this history. It's liable to come up, and I just want to tell you about it, and I want you to know about it. You can look it up in Eclipse or whatever. And he said, fine, I'm glad you told me. And that was that. And I might have said something about it that obviously Nixon had a role in the McCarthy period and one thing and another. And so, if all things, it never came up until around the time John Dean was going to testify. A guy who was a source of mine in Lowell Weiker's office called and said, "You're not going to believe this, but somebody came in here from the White House today and told Weiker that the reason for the Washington Post of his criminality as a president of the United States, and what we know of the scale of that criminality because of the tapes, and his view and conduct before the break-in at Watergate to the day, June 17th, 1971, what they mean is smear Lyndon Johnson, if only they have those documents." Nixon says, "I don't care what you have to do to get those documents. Firebomb the goddamn. This might be wrong." Not a word. And so that's what you're dealing with. And yes, Nixon biography. And I remember when I first went to the Nixon Library, being very moved by his childhood and the awful circumstances of his family and the loss of a sibling, and because of his conduct in his case, and he was right about his, turns out. It's given me a lot of thought since. And Nixon knew he was right about his. And he says on those tapes, "They've been after me ever since the Hiss case." Just something to think about. Well, it couldn't be more relevant now, partly because of what I said about the system working, because what you see now is how broken the system is, how impossibly dismantled even the system seems to have become in terms of the various institutions involved, including the press to some extent. Though, there's an awful lot of great reporting that's going on and has gone on since Watergate, including great investigative reporting. I mean, I would make an argument that we live in the golden age of investigative reporting. If you went online and you looked at all the investigative reporting organizations in the United States and in countries where despots rule, including in Russia, great investigative reporting that's been done in Russia. But the big difference to me is, I'll often ask, what if, could this story be replicated today? And obviously it's a different time, but the reporters are there and the editors are there. And one of the reasons editors are there because they've seen Ben Bradlee up there on the screen and they've read about this. And if you look at Spotlight, which is like All the President's Men, the great thing about All the President's Men, the movie, is it's not about Woodward and me. The personality in it is Bradlee. He's the only real personality. Woodward and I, what you see through Woodward and me in that movie is the process of reporting. It's not about our private lives. It's not about our personas. It's about our repertorial personas, and what I said earlier about the complimentary and flipping roles and all that. But it's really, what that movie is about, knocking on doors, McDonald's wrappers piling up, establishing relationship with sources, and then Bradlee presiding over all of it brilliantly. So I think that the legacy of Bradlee is there, and you see that legacy in Spotlight, which is the modern great reporting film, which is about one of the greatest pieces of reporting ever. And again, a powerful institution and abusing its power hideously, the Catholic Church. So, but what is so different today, and there's no metric for this. I can't cite a Pew Trust study to give you numbers, but I know I'm right about this. And that is that interest in this country by its citizens in the best obtainable version of the truth is nothing like it was at the time of Watergate. People in this country, including those in the political system, were willing to be open to fact and the best obtainable version of the truth, no matter how anathema those facts were to their partisanship, whatever, political philosophies. Totally different than today. Today, people are looking at media in terms of finding and choosing sources of information and stories that reinforce what they already believe instead of the best obtainable version of the truth. And that is perhaps, you can yell and scream all you want about the performance in the media. I think we got to also look at the performance and open-mindedness of our citizens, because now you can say, well, it's brainwashing, it's social media, it's this, that, and the other. And incidentally, it goes both ways. It's not about the Republicans, not about the Democrats, but the predilection to seek out information to buttress what somebody already believes is, for so many people, the basic choice in reading, viewing, processing information. That's the breakdown. And I'm not sure that All the President's Men or 100 movies about journalism can address that problem. I don't think it's about cynicism. I think it's never think that that journalism is separate from the rest of the culture, that politics or Washington is separate from the rest of the culture. Yes, it's a bubble. Yes, it's dysfunctional, particularly the Congress of the United States, totally dysfunctional institution. But there's an interaction from the country out there that and the people of the country. Washington is not in a vacuum in that sense. This is a two-way street, and the street that the citizens are riding is awful clogged up with a lot of awful traffic jam. First of all, there's one thing we haven't talked about: luck. Ben was lucky. We were lucky. Don't underestimate that. And I think it's true in what's certainly what happened in Ben's life. It's really true in all our lives that we've been awful lucky. No matter what the stumbles, Janet Cook, marriages, all the rest, we've still been pretty lucky. So I wouldn't underestimate that. And I think Ben had to recognize this, incidentally. Bob recognizes it. I think I recognize it. And part of that luck is the interaction of the three of us. I miss him. Is there a voice that says to me when I know I'm about to do something, Bernstein, you're full of shit, you better watch that, you better pull back? I would say that's probably Bradley's voice. I hope I hear it. And unlike someone in my family, that voice was inculcated, and as well as the voice of, you know what you're doing out there, just do what you know you're supposed to do. And all of that comes, I haven't thought this through, there also been through the years struggles with Bradley and me in our own relationship, and yet it's it's part of who I am, and that voice is always there.